The heat in Tucson didn't quit, even at 9:30 on a Thursday night in late August. Emma felt it clinging to her skin like a second layer as she stepped out of the Desert Rose, a dive bar on South 6th Avenue where the neon buzzed like dying insects, and the air smelled of cigarettes, spilled beer, and decades of stories soaked into the wooden walls. She'd only gone in for a drink after work, something to dull the edge of another long shift at Tucson Medical Center, but the crowd inside had been too loud, too close, pressing in on her with their laughter and their shouting, and she'd needed air. The parking lot was half empty, lit by a single flickering streetlight that cast long, dancing shadows across the cracked asphalt. The pavement still radiated heat from the day, and Emma could feel it through the thin soles of her sneakers. Her car was parked near the back, beside a row of motorcycles that gleamed under the pale light like predators at rest, their chrome catching and reflecting the yellow glow in sharp, angular patterns. She'd noticed them when she arrived. Harleys, mostly, customized and chrome-heavy, the kind that rumbled through downtown on weekends with enough noise to rattle storefront windows and set car alarms wailing in their wake. She was halfway to her Honda when she heard the voice cutting through the night air. Hey, I'm talking to you." Emma's stomach dropped, that sick, familiar feeling of dread pooling low in her belly. She knew that tone. Aggressive, entitled, slurred just enough to be dangerous. The kind men used when they wanted to make themselves bigger by making someone else smaller. She turned slowly, her keys already gripped between her fingers like a makeshift weapon, the way her roommate had taught her years ago. The man stumbling toward her was in his 40s, thick around the middle, wearing a polo shirt stained with something dark, beer maybe, or whiskey. His face was flushed red either from the heat or the alcohol or both, and his eyes had that glassy, unfocused look of someone who'd crossed the line 3 drinks ago and kept going. "I said, I'm talking to you," he repeated, louder now, his voice echoing off the concrete block wall of the bar. He jabbed a finger in her direction, the gesture unsteady. "You think you're too good to say hi? I saw you in there, acting all stuck up, looking down your nose at everybody." Emma's throat tightened, her mouth going dry. "I don't know you," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage even as her pulse hammered in her ears. "Please leave me alone." "Leave you alone?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that made her skin crawl. "You women are all the same. Walk around like you own the place, dress like that, won't give a guy the time of day. Think you're better than everyone." He was closing the distance between them now, his steps uneven but determined, and Emma felt the heat of panic rising in her chest, competing with the oppressive desert air. There were people inside the bar. She could hear music and voices through the open door. But no one out here. No one except, "That's close enough." The voice came from behind her, low and even, with the kind of weight that didn't need volume to carry authority. It cut through the tension like a blade through butter. Emma turned and saw him stepping out of the shadows near the motorcycles, materializing like he'd been waiting there all along. He was tall, easily 6'2", with broad shoulders that strained the leather of his vest. The vest was black, worn soft with age and use, and bore a patch on the back she couldn't fully see from this angle, but she knew what it was. Everyone in Tucson knew the colors, knew what they meant. Hell's Angels. The kind of man most people crossed the street to avoid, the kind mothers warned their daughters about, the kind that carried a reputation heavy enough to clear a room. His face was all hard angles, sharp jaw dusted with stubble, strong nose that looked like it had been broken at least once, eyes that were dark and unreadable in the dim light. His hair was longer than you'd expect, dark brown and pulled back loosely at the nape of his neck, and there was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow that gave him a dangerous look, even when he wasn't trying. His arms were thick with muscle and covered in tattoos that disappeared under the sleeves of his black t-shirt. But it wasn't his size or his scars or his ink that made Emma's breath catch. It was the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, economical, like he had all the time in the world and knew exactly how to use it. Like violence was a tool he kept in his back pocket, but didn't need to brandish. The drunk man swayed on his feet, squinting at the biker like he was trying to bring him into focus. "This your girlfriend or something? She with you?" "Doesn't matter," the biker said, positioning himself between Emma and the stranger with an ease that felt practiced, natural. His body became a wall, solid and immovable. "What matters is you're done here. Who the hell do you think you are?" The drunk man's voice rose, trying to reclaim some of the authority he'd lost. I'm just trying to talk to her. This is a free country, man. I can talk to whoever I want." The biker didn't answer right away. He just stood there, hands loose at his sides, shoulders squared, feet planted, radiating a kind of quiet authority that made the air feel heavier, thicker. The silence stretched out, became uncomfortable, and Emma realized he was doing it on purpose, letting the drunk man sit with his own words, letting the weight of the situation settle over him like a shroud. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost conversational, the kind of calm that felt more dangerous than shouting. "I think I'm the guy telling you to walk away while you still can, while you've still got the choice." There was no explicit threat in the words, nothing that could be repeated or used against him, but the way he said it, calm, matter of fact, like he was stating a simple truth about gravity or the sunrise, made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a debate. This was the last exit before the road got dark and dangerous. The drunk man seemed to sense it too. His bravado flickered and died like a candle in the wind, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty, then fear. He glanced at Emma, then back at the biker, then at the motorcycles lined up behind him like a silent jury of metal and chrome. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Whatever, man. She's not worth it anyway. Bitch probably has a stick up her ass." He muttered something else under his breath, something Emma couldn't make out, then turned and stumbled back toward the bar, his footsteps uneven on the asphalt, his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. Emma exhaled, a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were trembling, and she pressed them against her thighs to steady them, feeling the adrenaline still coursing through her system like electricity. The biker turned to face her, and for the first time she got a good look at his eyes. They were dark brown, almost black in the low light, and they held hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed, like he could see straight through her carefully constructed walls to the fear and relief churning underneath. "You all right?" he asked. His voice was gentler now, softer, but still carried that underlying strength. Emma nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was. Her throat felt tight, and when she tried to speak, it came out rough. "Thank you, I thank you. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't. Don't worry about it." He cut her off, not unkindly. "Get to your car. I'll wait here. Make sure he doesn't come back out." She should have left then. Should have thanked him again and gotten in her Honda and driven home without looking back. Should have added this to the list of close calls and near misses that came with being a woman alone at night. But something held her in place. The way he'd stepped in without hesitation. The way he'd stood between her and danger without making her feel small or fragile, or like she owed him something. "Why did you help me?" she heard herself ask, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. Because he was out of line. Most people would have just stayed out of it, would have said it wasn't their business. "I'm not most people." He said it simply, like it was just a fact, not a boast. There was a pause, charged with something Emma couldn't name. The night air felt thick, heavy with heat and unspoken things and the lingering ozone smell that meant rain was coming soon. Even though the sky was clear, she could hear the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, the faint buzz of the streetlight overhead, the muffled sounds of the bar behind them. "What's your name?" she asked, surprising herself again. He hesitated, like he was deciding whether or not to answer, weighing something in his mind. Finally he said, "Jake." "Emma." She extended her hand, and after a moment he took it. His palm was warm and calloused, rough with work and riding, and his grip was firm but careful. The handshake lasted a beat longer than it should have. He nodded once, as if filing the information away. "Emma, get home safe." This time she did turn to leave, but as she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat, the interior still hot from sitting in the sun all evening, she glanced back through the windshield and found him still standing there, hands in his pockets now, watching her with that same unreadable expression, waiting, making sure. She pulled out of the parking lot, her heart still racing, her hands still shaking slightly on the wheel, and told herself it was just adrenaline, just the aftermath of fear and relief colliding in her chest, chemical reactions firing through her nervous system. But deep down she knew it was something else, something about the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd stood between her and harm without making it about him, without demanding gratitude or payment or anything in return. Something about the quiet intensity in his eyes and the controlled power in his stance. Emma drove home through the empty streets of Tucson, past the closed shops and the scattered streetlights, and couldn't stop thinking about a man named Jake who'd stepped out of the shadows when she needed him most. 3 days passed before Emma saw him again, and she spent every one of those days telling herself she wasn't thinking about him. She told herself she wasn't looking for him when she returned to the Desert Rose on Sunday evening, that she'd only come back because it was on her way home from her shift at the hospital, and she needed to unwind after a brutal 12 hours of holding hands with dying patients and cleaning up more blood than anyone should see in a single day. The ER had been chaos, a multi-car pileup on I-10, 2 stabbings, and a kid who'd fallen off a roof, and Emma's nerves were frayed raw. But when she pushed through the door and scanned the dim interior, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness after the bright desert sun, her gaze went straight to the row of bar stools near the back. He wasn't there. Disappointed, though she wouldn't have admitted it, not even to herself, Emma took a seat at the bar and ordered a whiskey sour. The bartender, a grizzled man in his 60s named Ray with tattoos covering both arms and a gray beard that reached his chest, gave her a knowing look but didn't say anything. He'd been tending bar at the Desert Rose for 30 years and had seen everything twice. The bar was busier tonight, packed with the usual mix of locals and bikers and people who didn't quite fit anywhere else. The jukebox in the corner was playing old country, something twangy and melancholy that Emma didn't recognize, and the air smelled like fryer oil and leather and stale cigarettes, despite the smoking ban that nobody bothered to enforce here. Emma was halfway through her drink, idly watching a game of pool in the corner and trying not to think about the teenager she'd lost on the table that afternoon, when she felt it, that prickle of awareness that comes from being watched. The hair on the back of her neck stood up and she turned her head slowly and found Jake standing near the pool table, a cue stick in one hand, his eyes locked on hers across the crowded room. Her breath caught in her throat. He said something to the man he'd been playing with, a shorter guy with a shaved head and a thick beard, then set the cue down and walked over, moving through the crowd with the same unhurried confidence she remembered. People moved out of his way without seeming to realize they were doing it, creating a path like water parting around a stone. "Didn't expect to see you back here," he said, leaning against the bar beside her. He was wearing jeans and a black t-shirt tonight, the vest nowhere in sight, but he still carried that same presence, that same quiet authority. "Didn't expect to come back," Emma admitted, taking another sip of her drink. "But you did." It wasn't a question, and the way he said it, low, almost teasing with a hint of something that might have been amusement, made heat rise in her cheeks. She took another sip of her drink to cover it, letting the sharp tang of whiskey and lemon burn down her throat. "Wanted to thank you properly," she said, meeting his eyes, "for the other night." Jake's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, something warm. "You already thanked me." "I know, but She hesitated, searching for the right words, trying to articulate something she didn't fully understand herself. "I've been thinking about it, about what you did, and I wanted you to know it mattered, that it meant something." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with that same intensity that made her feel like he could see straight through her, like he was reading something written in a language only he understood. Then he said, "You didn't deserve what that guy said to you. Simple as that. Most men wouldn't have stepped in. They would have pretended not to see, or thought it wasn't their problem. Then they're cowards." The bluntness of it startled her. There was no ego in the way he said it, no performative chivalry or macho posturing, just a plain statement of fact, delivered with the kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. Emma found herself leaning closer, drawn in by the pull of him, by the magnetic quality she couldn't quite name. "Can I buy you a drink?" Jake's mouth curved into a faint smile, the first real one she'd seen from him, and it transformed his face, softened the hard edges just enough to make him seem almost approachable. "You don't have to do that. I want to." He held her gaze for a beat longer, something passing between them in that look, and then he nodded slowly. "All right. Whiskey. Neat." Emma signaled Ray, who poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a glass and slid it across the bar with practiced ease. Jake picked it up, clinked it lightly against her glass with a soft chime, and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. They talked for an hour, longer than Emma had intended, longer than she'd planned. Time seemed to move differently in his presence, stretching and compressing in strange ways. She learned that Jake had grown up in Tucson, that he'd been riding motorcycles since he was 16 when his older brother taught him on a beat-up Yamaha they'd rebuilt together in their garage. She learned that he worked as a mechanic at a shop off East Broadway, specializing in custom bikes and restoration work, that he could rebuild an engine blindfolded, and had a reputation for being able to fix anything with wheels. He didn't volunteer much about the club, and she didn't push. Some things she understood instinctively weren't meant to be asked about. There were lines, boundaries, territories that required invitation before crossing. In turn, she told him about her job as an ER nurse, about the chaos of overnight shifts and the strange, dark satisfaction of stitching people back together, of pulling them back from the edge when death was breathing down their necks. She told him about growing up in Phoenix, about moving to Tucson 3 years ago for a fresh start after a bad breakup with a man who'd slowly tried to make himself the center of her universe until there was no room left for her own dreams. She told him about how the desert felt like home in a way the city never had, how she loved the vast emptiness and the way the mountains turned purple at sunset. Jake listened, really listened, in a way that made her feel heard, seen, understood. He didn't interrupt or offer unsolicited advice or try to fix her problems. He just nodded, his dark eyes never leaving hers, occasionally asking a question that showed he was tracking every word, and Emma found herself saying more than she'd planned, opening up in ways she usually didn't with near strangers. "You're good at this," she said after a while, gesturing with her glass. "Listening, I mean. Most people just wait for their turn to talk." Jake shrugged, a small movement of his broad shoulders. "Most people don't have anything interesting to say. You do." The simple compliment, delivered so matter-of-factly, made Emma's chest feel tight. She smiled, feeling warm from more than just the whiskey. "What about you? What do you do when you're not fixing bikes or rescuing women in parking lots?" "Ride, mostly. There's nothing like it. The open road, the wind, the freedom. Everything else just falls away." His voice took on a quality she hadn't heard before, something almost reverent. "Sometimes I'll ride out to Saguaro National Park early in the morning, watch the sunrise over the cacti, or take Gates Pass up to the west side, look out over the whole valley. That sounds beautiful." "It is." He paused, then added, "You should come with me sometime." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "I'd like that." When she finally glanced at her phone and saw that it was past 11, she felt a pang of regret, a strange reluctance to let the evening end. She didn't want to go back to her empty apartment, didn't want to break this spell that seemed to have settled over them. "I should go," she said reluctantly, hearing the disappointment in her own voice. Jake nodded, setting down his empty glass. "I'll walk you out." They stepped into the parking lot together, the night air still warm and dry despite the late hour, carrying that distinctive desert smell of creosote and dust. The temperature had dropped maybe 10 degrees since she'd arrived, which in Tucson counted as cool. Emma's car was parked closer this time, just a few spots from the entrance, but Jake stayed with her until she reached the door, his presence solid and reassuring beside her. "Thanks again," she said, unlocking the car with a beep. "For tonight and for the other night. For being a decent human being in a world that doesn't have enough of them. Anytime." There was a pause, and Emma felt the tension shift, subtle but unmistakable, the air between them charging with possibility. Jake was standing close enough that she could smell the faint scent of motor oil and leather, could see the way his chest rose and fell with each breath, could count the flecks of gold in his dark eyes under the parking lot lights. "I'd like to see you again," she said before she could stop herself, before fear or common sense could talk her out of it. Jake's expression softened, just a fraction, the hard lines around his mouth easing. "You know where to find me?" Emma smiled, feeling bold, feeling like someone braver than she usually was. "I do." She got into her car and started the engine, but before she pulled away, she rolled down the window and called out to him. "Jake?" He turned, one hand resting on the seat of his motorcycle, which she now noticed was parked just a few spaces away, a beautiful black and chrome Harley that gleamed under the lights. "Why did you really help me that night? And don't say it's because he was out of line. There's more to it than that." He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze steady on hers, and Emma could see him weighing his words, deciding how much truth to give her. Then he said, his voice low and rough, "Because you looked scared, and no one should have to feel that way. No one should have to wonder if they're safe walking to their car. That's not the world I want to live in." Emma's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't quite name. She nodded, unable to find words that felt adequate, and drove away with the image of him burned into her mind, standing alone in the parking lot, hands in his pockets, watching her leave like he'd guard her from a distance if she asked him to, like he'd be there if she needed him. And for the first time in 3 years, since she'd left Phoenix and the wreckage of her old life behind, Emma felt something she hadn't expected to feel again: hope. Emma started coming to the Desert Rose more often after that. Not every night. She couldn't afford the time or the money, and her schedule at the hospital was unpredictable at best. But enough that it became routine, a ritual she looked forward to after long shifts when her feet ached and her mind was too full of other people's pain. Jake was always there, either playing pool with the other bikers or nursing a drink at the bar, and every time she walked in, his eyes would find hers across the room like a compass needle pointing north, like he'd been waiting for her. They didn't talk about what was happening between them. They didn't need to. It was in the way he'd saved the stool next to him when the bar got crowded, waving off other people who tried to sit there. It was in the way her hand would brush his when she reached for her drink, those accidental touches that lasted a half-second too long to be truly accidental. It was in the charged silence that stretched between them when the conversation lulled, heavy with things neither of them was quite ready to say. Emma learned more about him in fragments, pieces of a puzzle she was slowly assembling. She learned that his brother, Marcus, had died in a motorcycle accident when Jake was 19, that the club had become his family after that, filling the void that grief had carved out. She learned that he'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine, that he didn't like to talk about it, but sometimes his eyes would go distant in a way that told her he was seeing things she couldn't. She learned that he took his coffee black, that he had a scar on his left side from a knife fight he refused to elaborate on, that he read more than people expected, mostly history and biography, books about people who'd lived hard lives and survived them. In turn, Jake learned about her. He learned about her parents, who'd died in a car accident when she was 23, leaving her alone in the world with nothing but student loans and grief. He learned about her ex, Derek, who'd been charming and attentive until he wasn't, until he'd slowly isolated her from her friends and made her feel like she was crazy for wanting her own life. He learned about why she became a nurse, about a childhood friend who'd survived cancer because of the nurses who'd fought for her when the doctors had given up. One Friday night in mid-September, the heat finally broke. A storm rolled in from the east, bringing with it the smell of rain and creosote and electricity, that distinctive petrichor smell that made the desert come alive. By the time Emma arrived at the bar after an evening shift, the sky was dark and heavy with clouds, the air thick with anticipation and the promise of violence. Jake was outside when she pulled into the parking lot, leaning against his bike and watching the lightning fork across the horizon in brilliant, jagged lines. He straightened when he saw her, and Emma felt that familiar flutter in her chest, that sensation like falling that she was starting to crave. "Storm's coming," he said as she approached, stating the obvious but making it sound like something more. "I can see that. You should have stayed home. These monsoons can be dangerous. Flash floods, lightning, roads turning into rivers. I didn't want to." Emma looked up at the sky, feeling the first few drops of rain on her skin, warm and fat and scattered. "Besides, I like storms, always have." Jake's mouth quirked into a half-smile, that expression that made her stomach flip. "Of course you do. You like things that are dangerous." "Do I?" She met his eyes, letting the challenge hang in the air between them. "Yeah, you do." They went inside and found a corner booth near the back, away from the noise of the jukebox and the growing crowd seeking shelter from the storm. The rain started in earnest, drumming against the metal roof like 1,000 impatient fingers, a sound that was almost deafening. The lights flickered once, twice, dimming and brightening before steadying. Emma ordered her usual whiskey sour, and Jake got a beer this time, something local from a brewery on 4th Avenue. They sat across from each other, close enough that their knees touched under the table, and Emma felt the tension ratchet up another notch, felt it humming between them like a live wire. "Can I ask you something?" she said after a while, after they'd fallen into one of those comfortable silences that felt like intimacy. Jake nodded, his eyes on hers, giving her his full attention in that way he had. "Why do you keep coming back here? To this bar? It can't just be for the ambiance or the excellent selection of beer." He took a slow sip of his beer, considering the question, turning it over in his mind. "It's familiar, uncomplicated. I know everyone here, or at least I know their type. There are rules even if they're not written down. Everyone understands how things work. Is that what you want? Uncomplicated? Usually. He paused, his gaze intensifying. Not always. But not lately. Jake's jaw tightened slightly, and Emma felt the weight of his attention settle over her like a physical thing, warm and heavy. Not lately. Not since a woman with kind eyes and a smart mouth walked into my bar and complicated everything. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication, with confession. Emma's pulse quickened, her mouth going dry. "Jake, you should know something," he said, cutting her off gently but firmly, his voice dropping lower. "I'm not a good bet, Emma. The life I live, the people I'm around, the things I've done, and the things I might have to do, it's not clean. It's not safe. There are parts of it I can never tell you about, and if you're smart, you won't ask." "I didn't ask for safe." Emma leaned forward, closing the distance between them, refusing to back down. "I've done safe. Safe is boring. Safe is suffocating. Safe is waking up one day and realizing you've disappeared into someone else's idea of who you should be. Maybe you should want safe. Maybe you should want normal. A guy with a 9-to-5 and a 401k and no history that could come back to haunt you." Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his, her fingers curling around his calloused palm, feeling the warmth and strength there. "Stop telling me what I should want. Stop trying to protect me from myself. I'm a grown woman. I make my own decisions and I deal with the consequences." "I know you can," Jake said, his voice rough, strained. "But I also know what it's like to drag someone into something they didn't sign up for. I've seen what happens to people who get too close to this life. And I won't do that to you. I won't be responsible for dimming that light you have." "Then don't," Emma said fiercely, squeezing his hand. "Don't drag me anywhere. Just be honest with me. That's all I'm asking. Don't lie, don't hide who you are, and let me decide if I can handle it. Give me that much credit." Jake held her gaze for a long moment, and Emma could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. The war between wanting something and knowing better, between reaching for what he wanted and trying to do the right thing. She could see the exact moment something shifted. Something gave way. "I think about you," he said quietly, the admission seeming to cost him something. "More than I should. More than is probably healthy. You're the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing on my mind before I sleep. I keep wondering what it would be like to—" He stopped, shook his head. "This is a bad idea." "Probably," Emma agreed, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "But I think about you too. All the time. I think about your hands and your voice, and the way you look at me like I matter, like I'm not invisible. You're not invisible, Emma. You're the opposite of invisible. You're the brightest thing in any room you walk into. Then stop pushing me away. I'm trying to protect you. I don't need protection from you. I need—" Emma stopped, swallowed hard, trying to find the courage to say what she really meant. "I need you to stop deciding what's best for me and let me choose. Let me choose you, if that's what I want." Jake's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body going taut. For a moment Emma thought he might pull away, might retreat back behind those walls he kept so carefully maintained. But then his hand turned over, his fingers lacing through hers with an urgency that took her breath away, and the simple act of it sent a jolt of electricity up her arm and straight to her heart. "Emma." His voice was rough, abraded, like the word had been dragged over broken glass. The lights went out. The bar plunged into darkness so complete it felt disorienting, and for a split second the only sound was the rain hammering against the roof like it was trying to break through and the startled murmurs of the other patrons. Thunder cracked overhead, so close and loud it rattled the windows. Then someone lit a candle behind the bar, and another, and the dim glow spread through the room like a slow exhale, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Emma could still feel Jake's hand in hers, warm and solid and grounding, an anchor in the sudden darkness. She could hear his breathing, steady and controlled even as her own came fast and shallow, and when he spoke, his voice was closer than before, intimate in a way that made her shiver despite the heat. "Come on," he said, standing and pulling her gently to her feet. "I'll take you home. I can drive." Emma started to protest, but even as she said it, she could hear how the rain had intensified, could hear it sheeting down outside like someone had opened a faucet in the sky. "Not in this storm. Roads'll flood. Washes'll be running. Your car won't make it, and I'm not letting you try." Emma wanted to argue, wanted to insist on her independence and capability, but she knew he was right. The streets in Tucson turned into rivers when the monsoons hit hard. And her little Honda was no match for even 6 inches of rushing water. People died every year trying to cross flooded intersections, convinced they could make it. "All right," she said quietly, feeling the weight of the decision, understanding that this was about more than just the storm. They left the bar together, Jake's hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they navigated through the crowd of stranded patrons. Outside, the rain was coming down in sheets so thick Emma could barely see 10 feet in front of her. They were both soaked within seconds, the warm water plastering her scrubs to her body and his t-shirt to his chest. Lightning flashed, turning the world white for a heartbeat, and in that instant, Emma saw Jake's face clearly, concerned, protective, wanting. Jake swung his leg over the bike with practiced ease and held out a hand to her. The Harley looked beautiful and dangerous in the rain, all black chrome and power. "Ever ridden before?" he asked, raising his voice to be heard over the storm. "No," Emma admitted, feeling a thrill of fear and excitement. "Trust me?" Emma looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the question beneath the question. This wasn't just about the bike or the storm or getting her home safely. This was about everything. This was about whether she was willing to take the leap, to step off the edge into unknown territory with a man who lived by different rules, who existed in spaces she'd never been. "Yes," she said without hesitation. She climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and felt the heat of his body even through the rain and wet clothes. His stomach was hard with muscle, and she could feel him breathing, could feel the steady rise and fall of his chest. The engine roared to life beneath them, a deep, primal sound that vibrated through her bones and made her feel alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. And then they were moving, cutting through the storm with a recklessness that should have scared her, but didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Jake didn't take her home. He took her to a small house on the east side of town, a single-story adobe with a carport and a yard full of gravel and carefully maintained cactus gardens, prickly pear and barrel cactus, and a towering saguaro that must have been 100 years old. The rain was still pouring when he pulled into the driveway, and by the time they got inside, they were both drenched, water dripping onto the tile floor and forming puddles around their feet. "I'll get you a towel," Jake said, his voice sounding strange in the sudden quiet, and he disappeared down a hallway, leaving Emma standing in the living room. She took in her surroundings, curious about this glimpse into his private life. The space was simple, almost sparse, but it was clean and organized in a way that spoke of discipline. There was a worn leather couch the color of whiskey, a coffee table stacked with motorcycle magazines and a few books with cracked spines, a bookshelf filled with more tools than books, but also unexpected titles: Cormac McCarthy, Larry McMurtry, some histories of the American West. The walls were decorated with a few framed photographs of motorcycles and desert landscapes, and there was a guitar in the corner that looked well used. It was masculine and unpretentious, and somehow it fit him perfectly. Jake returned with 2 towels, soft and thick, and handed her one. His t-shirt was plastered to his chest, highlighting every muscle, every line, and Emma had to force herself to look away. "You can dry off in the bathroom if you want. Down the hall, second door. There might be some clothes in there you can borrow. My ex left some things. Thanks." Emma locked herself in the bathroom and peeled off her wet scrubs, wringing them out over the tub before hanging them on the shower rod. She caught her reflection in the mirror, hair plastered to her head, mascara smudged under her eyes, skin flushed from the heat and the ride and something else, and let out a shaky laugh. This wasn't how she'd imagined the night going. This wasn't what she'd planned. But maybe that was the point. Maybe she was tired of plans, tired of playing it safe. She found a pair of sweatpants and an oversized t-shirt in a cabinet and pulled them on. They were too big, but they were dry and soft, and they smelled like laundry detergent and faintly like Jake, motor oil and leather and something warm and male underneath. When she came out, Jake had changed into dry jeans and a black t-shirt that somehow looked even better on him than the wet one had. He'd made coffee, and the smell of it filled the small house, rich and dark and comforting. "Thought you might be cold," he said, handing her a mug. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and Emma felt that now familiar spark. "Thank you." She wrapped her hands around the mug, grateful for the warmth even though the house wasn't actually cold. They sat on the couch, a careful distance between them, and for a while neither of them spoke. The rain had softened to a steady patter against the roof, and the sound of it was strangely soothing, like white noise designed to fill the awkward spaces. "I'm sorry," Jake said finally. breaking the silence. For dragging you out here. For putting you in this position. You didn't drag me, I came willingly. I wanted to come. Still, this isn't... I shouldn't have brought you here. Emma set her mug down on the coffee table with a decisive click and turned to face him fully. Jake, what are we doing here? And I don't mean literally, I mean all of this. The dancing around each other, the almosts and not quites. What are we doing? He looked at her, his expression torn, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. I don't know. Yes, you do. Stop lying to me. Stop lying to yourself. He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his damp hair, pushing it back from his face. When he spoke, his voice was raw, honest in a way that made her chest ache. All right? Yeah, I do. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, choosing his words carefully like he was disarming a bomb. I want you, Emma. I have since that first night, since I saw you standing in that parking lot trying to be brave even though you were scared. But I also know what I am, and what I'm not. And I'm not the kind of guy you take home to meet your parents. I'm not the kind of guy who's going to give you a white picket fence and a golden retriever and Sunday dinners with the family. I don't care about that. I don't want that. You should. You deserve someone better than me, someone clean and uncomplicated, someone who doesn't come with the kind of baggage I've got strapped to my back. Why do you get to decide what I deserve? Emma's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through. I'm 31 years old. I've lived through my parents dying, through a relationship that nearly broke me, through more death and pain in the ER than most people see in a lifetime. I think I've earned the right to make my own choices about what I want and who I want it with. Jake's jaw tightened, every muscle in his body going taut with tension. This life, my life, it's not what you think it is. There are things I can't tell you, things I've done that would make you look at me differently. There are dangers, Emma, real ones, people I'm associated with, situations that could blow up without warning. And if you're with me, you're part of that world whether you like it or not. You become a target, a liability, a weakness someone could exploit. Then don't make me a weakness. Make me a strength. Trust me enough to handle it. It's not about trust. Yes, it is. Emma leaned closer, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, until she could count his eyelashes. It's exactly about trust. You're afraid. You're afraid of what might happen. Afraid of letting someone in, afraid of caring about someone enough that losing them would destroy you. I get it, Jake. I really do. But you can't protect me from everything, and you shouldn't have to. Let me make my own choices. Let me choose you, with full knowledge of what that means. Jake stared at her for a long moment, and Emma could see the war still raging behind his eyes. Desire warring with responsibility, want warring with fear. But this time, something shifted. She saw the exact second he made his decision. It was in the way his shoulders relaxed fractionally, the way his grip on the couch cushion tightened and then released, the way his eyes softened just a fraction, letting her see the man underneath the armor. I don't want to hurt you, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. That's the last thing I want. Then don't. Be honest with me. That's all I need. Honesty and respect and the knowledge that you see me as an equal, not something fragile that needs protecting. Jake reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, and cupped her face in his hand. His palm was warm and calloused against her cheek, rough from work and riding, and his thumb brushed across her cheekbone with a tenderness that made her breath catch. You're not like anyone I've ever met, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're brave and strong and you don't take shit from anyone, including me. You look at me like I'm worth something, like I'm more than just my mistakes and my past. You are worth something. You're worth everything. Emma, stop talking, she whispered, and then she kissed him. It wasn't rushed or rough or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, exploratory, like she was learning the shape and taste of him. His lips were warm against hers, softer than she'd expected, and when Emma opened her mouth to him, she tasted coffee and rain and something darker, something that felt like promise and danger and home all at once. Jake made a low sound in the back of his throat, surprise, pleasure, surrender, and pulled her closer, one hand sliding into her damp hair, the other settling on her waist with a possessiveness that sent heat flooding through her body. Emma felt the last of her restraint crumble like a wall made of sand, felt herself melting into him, and she climbed into his lap, straddling him on the couch, feeling the hard muscle of his thighs beneath her. She felt his sharp intake of breath against her mouth, felt his hands tighten on her waist, pulling her impossibly closer. Emma. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer and a curse all at once. "Don't stop," she whispered against his mouth, her hands sliding up his chest, feeling his heart hammering beneath her palms. "Please don't stop." He didn't. He kissed her like he'd been holding back for weeks, like she was air and he'd been drowning, like she was the answer to a question he'd been too afraid to ask. His hands moved over her body with a reverence that made her shiver, tracing the curve of her spine, the dip of her waist, the swell of her hips, learning her geography like he was memorizing a map. Emma lost herself in the sensation of him, the heat of his skin, the taste of his mouth, the sound of his breathing going ragged, the way his muscles tensed beneath her hands. She'd never felt anything like this overwhelming combination of desire and safety, of passion and tenderness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, faces flushed, Jake rested his forehead against hers, his hands still on her waist, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. "I don't want to hurt you," he repeated, his voice ragged, barely controlled. "Then don't. Just be here with me. Be present. Be honest. That's all I need. I'm serious, Emma. The life I live, it's not easy. There are things I can't tell you about club business, things I can't change even if I wanted to. There will be nights I can't explain where I've been or what I've been doing. There will be times when I have to put the club first, when I have to make choices that might not make sense to you. And if you're with me, you're part of that world whether you like it or not. People will look at you differently, they'll make assumptions." Emma pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her hands framing his face, feeling the stubble scratch against her palms. "I'm not asking you to change. I'm not asking you to give up your life or your family or who you are. I'm asking you to let me in, to trust me with the parts of yourself you can share. I understand there are lines, boundaries. I'm not naive, but I'm also not fragile. I can handle more than you think." Jake studied her for a long moment, searching her face like he was looking for cracks, for signs of doubt or fear. But Emma held his gaze steadily, letting him see her certainty, her resolve, her willingness to step into his world with open eyes. Finally, he said, "All right, all right." The word sounded like surrender, like relief, like the first breath after breaking the surface of water. "But you need to promise me something." "What?" "If it gets to be too much, if you change your mind, if you wake up one day and realize this isn't what you want, you tell me. You don't stay out of obligation or pity or because you think you can fix me. You just tell me the truth and you walk away. I can handle a lot of things, but I can't handle you staying when you don't want to be here." "I promise," Emma said, and she meant it. "But Jake, I'm not going anywhere. Not unless you give me a real reason to. And stepping in to protect me from some drunk asshole, or taking me home in a storm, or being afraid you might hurt me, those aren't reasons. Those are exactly why I want to stay." Jake's expression cracked, something vulnerable and raw breaking through the careful control, and he kissed her again, slower this time, deeper, with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. They stayed like that for hours, tangled together on the couch, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. Emma told him about the patients she couldn't save, about the guilt that followed her home some nights, about the weight of holding someone's hand while they died and being the last person to see the light leave their eyes. She told him about her fear that she was becoming numb to it, that she was building walls to protect herself, that might eventually keep out everything good along with the bad. Jake told her about his brother Marcus, about how they'd been inseparable growing up, how Marcus had been the good one, the one with plans and ambitions. He told her about the night he got the call, about standing in a hospital corridor not unlike the ones Emma walked every day, about how the club had been the only thing that kept him from completely falling apart. He told her about Afghanistan, not the details she knew he couldn't share, but the way it had changed him, the way it had shown him what he was capable of surviving. He told her about the first time he'd put on the colors, the weight of it, the responsibility, the sense of belonging to something larger than himself. He told her about the code they lived by, loyalty, brotherhood, protection of their own. He told her enough for her to understand, not enough to implicate her in anything, and Emma appreciated the careful balance he was striking. By the time the rain stopped and the first light of dawn crept through the windows, painting the room in shades of gold and pink, Emma felt like she knew him in a way she hadn't known anyone in years. She felt like she'd been let past the gates, allowed into the fortress, trusted with something precious. And when he drove her home later that morning, taking the long way so they could watch the sunrise over the Rincon Mountains, his hand resting on her thigh the whole way, she knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, but she didn't want to, because for the first time since moving to Tucson, since leaving Phoenix and the wreckage of her old life behind, Emma felt like she'd found something worth holding on to. Something real and raw and honest and a little dangerous, yes, but also something that made her feel alive in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Something like home. And as Jake kissed her goodbye on her front porch, the desert sun rising behind him and painting the sky in impossible shades of orange and purple, his hands gentle on her face, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, Emma realized that what had melted the room that night outside the bar wasn't just his strength or his protection, or his willingness to step between her and danger. It was the way he'd looked at her, then and now, like she mattered, like she was worth defending, worth protecting, worth knowing, like she was valuable not because she was fragile but because she was strong, like he could protect her without owning her, could want her without consuming her, could love her, and she thought maybe that's what this was becoming, love, without diminishing her. It was the tenderness hidden beneath all that rough masculine control. It was the gentleness in those scarred, calloused hands. It was the vulnerability he'd shown her, trusting her with pieces of himself he kept locked away from the rest of the world. It was the man underneath the armor, the heart underneath the leather and the ink and the reputation, and it was enough. It was more than enough. "I'll see you tonight?" Jake asked, his thumb brushing across her lower lip in a gesture that was intimate and possessive and tender all at once. The desert rose. Where else? His mouth curved into that half-smile she was coming to love. "It's where we belong." Emma smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in years, feeling like maybe she'd finally found her place in this desert city, her place with this complicated, dangerous, tender man. "Yeah, it is." She watched him walk back to his bike, admiring the way he moved, the confidence and power in every step. He threw one leg over the seat, started the engine with a roar that echoed through the quiet morning street, and looked back at her one more time. And in that look, Emma saw everything she needed to know. She saw the promise of protection without possession, passion without pain, honesty without games. She saw a future that might be uncertain, that might be complicated, that might require her to be braver than she'd ever been. But she also saw a man who would stand between her and danger every single time, who would fight for her without being asked, who would hold her tenderly, even with hands that knew violence. And as he drove away, the sound of his engine fading into the morning, Emma touched her fingers to her lips and smiled. This was just the beginning.